Welcome back, everybody, to our APUSH curriculum. We are up to topic 8.5, Culture After 1945. So we're going to leave a lot of politics and economics behind, although we will touch actually on both of those a little bit. And instead, we're going to focus more on what's going on in the culture and how it's changing, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, but mainly in the 50s. All right, let's get into this topic. So we're trying to figure out how American culture changed post-World War II. What are the big changes going on in American culture? And we're going to begin by really an extension of something we've been talking about since the 1920s, this, this golden age of consumerism. We talked in one of our earlier videos about how the post-war America was this economic growth time, really unprecedented in American history. And with all that extra money, and remember, sort of that pent-up demand for stuff, that's the reason it's pent up, of course, is because of the Great Depression followed by World War II. People, they want stuff, you know, they want to be able to spend their extra money on the things they think will make them happy. So let's take a little bit of, just a quick stroll through some big consumer changes going on in this time period. Now, McDonald's, you wouldn't think, I mean, it's a fast food place, right? You wouldn't be thinking it's big, maybe major historical moment or anything, but in fact, it kind of is, because with McDonald's and the birth of modern fast food, it really changes how we consume food. It changes how we think about food. You know, the idea of it being quick and cheap and always available. And, you know, omnipresent. You know, it doesn't matter where you go, you're going to find a McDonald's somewhere or some McDonald's equivalent on the side of the road. It really reflects how Americans are buying cars and traveling in greater numbers than ever as well. So, believe it or not, McDonald's is actually a pretty important historical event. The first one was opened up in 1948 out in California and will later spread across America. Not by the original McDonald's brothers, but rather a guy named Ray Kroc, who eventually is able to kind of wrestle the McDonald's company away from the McDonald's brothers. There's Ronald McDonald, or at least an early version of him. And I mentioned that McDonald's is kind of omnipresent. It seems like it's everywhere. It's not technically everywhere. You can see there are some countries that don't have McDonald's, but they're pretty much everywhere. And economists kind of half seriously use this thing called the Big Mac Index. And what that refers to is basically the average price of a Big Mac depending where you're at in the world. And it's a way of kind of comparing economies and cost of living and so forth. All right, now, 1949, this is a really big deal. Talk about consumer ease, right? You don't always have to have the cash on hand because what you now have is a credit card. And credit cards really come into their own in 1949. And the first company that issued this was called Diners Club. And I believe Diners Club is still around, but they've obviously been overtaken by things like Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover, all these other cards you see on TV in those commercials. Again, the credit card, this is just an extension of the things we looked at with the installment plan in the 1920s, the ease of credit and, frankly, the danger that comes along with that. 1955, Disneyland opens up in Anaheim, California, which is in Southern California. And this was kind of the first modern theme park. I mean, I guess there had been other things kind of similar to this in the past, but this will become the model. Obviously, Disney World in Florida and all the other theme parks you can think of really kind of come after this. And again, it reflects the affluence, the ease of travel, the ease of just having extra money to go do things that are fun, that really typifies the 1950s. Now, speaking of traveling, if you want to get around quickly, you want to be able to travel at high speeds, and that means a need to build the Interstate Highway System. Now, this is going to be a multi-decade project because we are building thousands and thousands of miles of these divided highways. They connect the suburbs to the cities. They connect cities to other cities. They really change how we travel and commute. It also has all kinds of commercial impacts as well. I mean, think about the last time you've been on the interstate, how many large trucks you see driving by carrying freight. This really does have a big impact on how Americans live and where we live as well. And if we're going to have new cars and new interstates, you might as well have some good styling to go with it. And so here's a selection of some cars from the 50s. I personally really like 1950s styling. I think it's just so unique. There's something just fun about it and modern, even though it's not modern from our perspective in the 21st century. For the people of the 1950s, it really was ultra modern. All right, television. So remember the radio and what impact it had on American culture and how there's this explosion of radio ownership in the 1920s and 30s. The same thing's going to happen with television in the 1950s. And television was a technology that really started, believe it or not, in the late 1920s. But with the Great Depression, World War II, it was more or less put on hold. There wasn't really a market for something this new and frankly expensive. And so it was really held off until the 1950s. And then TV ownership just explodes. And almost everybody had a TV in their home by the 1960s. With the TV, again, this touches back onto our idea of consumerism. With the TV comes easier ability to reach consumers and to tell them about your product and why they need to buy it and why their life is not complete without it. And also, this mass consumption of the same programs, whether it be a comedy show or a music performance or whatever, it leads to a more homogeneous mass culture. In other words, we're all kind of consuming the same stuff, and we're all watching the same thing and talking about it at school or at work, and it just leads to this culture that's kind of standardized across America. A couple of shows that are famous from this time period, The Honeymooners, starring Jackie Gleason on the left. This only went on, I believe, for one season. I don't think it was renewed, but it really took on a life on syndication, which is a fancy word for reruns, and it really is the first modern sitcom as we know it. Leave It to Beaver, a great example of sort of that stereotypical 1950s family where the father goes off to the office, the wife stays at home and takes care of the home, and the boys are, good-natured kiddos who are always going to do the right thing. And then there's I Love Lucy, starring Lucille Ball, famous comedian of this era. One thing I do want to mention is the 1950s is this really interesting mix of trying to stay conservative, but also embracing new ways of thinking about sex and gender and so forth. And I really like that. I think this is very funny. In the show I Love Lucy, this married couple is depicted as living in separate beds because you don't want to plant that idea in people's heads on TV that sex is going on, because that was considered kind of a taboo topic to talk about in public. All right, let's think about 1950s music, and of course, what comes to mind is a new genre called rock and roll. Now, we could talk for days about the history of rock and roll, but we're going to keep it very simple. This is a new music genre that comes out of really the late 40s, early 50s. Some of its predecessors, I should say, would be things like bluegrass, rhythm and blues, rockabilly, which is another type, honky-tonk music. It all kind of comes together to form this new thing called rock and roll. And while there were plenty of other stars, the most famous name of this early rock and roll era, of course, was Elvis Presley. He really was the first major rock star, the first major celebrity, in a way that we had never seen celebrities before. And for a lot of the baby boomer generation, rock and roll becomes basically the soundtrack of their life. You know, they listen to these songs fondly. years later, and it brings back all the memories of them being, teenagers and young adults and all that stuff, and they remember it. They remember listening to Rock Around the Clock or, Johnny B. Good or something like that. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that there's this interesting conflict between sort of conservative traditional values and this new openness, talking about sex and gender and so forth, and a woman who really helps exploit that gap and becomes a celebrity for her sexuality would be Marilyn Monroe. I think pretty much everyone's heard of her before, and she becomes a movie star, and she endorses all kinds of products, and she really becomes kind of the quintessential new woman, I guess you might call her, in America. Now, the reality is, though, of course, that most women were not living the life of Marilyn Monroe. But there is a big change going on. More and more women are going to work outside the home, and many of them are filling what we call white-collar jobs. So they're not on a construction site. They're not welding stuff or whatever. What they're doing is they're doing a lot of clerical work. So they might be a receptionist. They might be a typist. There's different jobs they can be doing. And many of the jobs that are created during this economic boom will go to young women. And you can see the percentage of women 16 and over in the labor force. I mean, there's a noticeable uptick starting in 1950, and it just keeps rising beyond that. Now, nonetheless, even though this is a time period where some women are really enjoying a more liberated status, and women are now working, becoming a little bit more economically, self-reliant and that sort of thing, there's also this call for more traditional values. And what we see is that cult of domesticity we've been looking at really for a good chunk of this course is really having its, in many ways, last heyday, where the woman is depicted as this happy stay-at-home mother who's cooking and cleaning, having just this amazing life of being a mother and really nothing else other than that. And you see that depicted in a lot of the consumer ads and popular culture. All right, now let's look at some criticisms of this new culture, and we're going to begin with a pushback against that model of a woman being the housewife. And the woman's name in this case is Betty Friedan. And Betty Friedan in 1963 wrote a book called The Feminist Mystique. And this book really hits like a bombshell, because what it does is it really comes out and criticizes the life of the stay-at-home suburban housewife. She describes the life as being boring, as being unfulfilling, as being lonely, and she really tries to blow the lid off that the happy scene you see on TV, watching Leave It to Beaver or I Love Lucy or something like that. She really tries to describe that there are some big downsides for women in that life, that their life is in many ways planned for them and they don't have a lot of independence. And this book helps then launch the modern women's rights movement. And we're going to we're going to read a short excerpt from The Feminist Mystique. So, the problem lay buried unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange, stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban housewife struggled with it alone. As she made the beds, shopped for groceries, she was afraid to even of herself to ask the silent question, is this all? Now, let's move on to our next social critic, and this is going to be a novel titled The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, Gray Flannel Suit, easy for me to say, written by Sloan Wilson in 1955. It would later be turned into a movie starring Gregory Peck, one of the great movie stars of his era. And the title, I think, is very interesting. The Gray Flannel Suit is seen as this, frankly, kind of boring style of dressing, that it looks like everybody else in the crowd. You just kind of blend in. You're just another face in the crowd. There's no individuality left. And what he talks about in this novel is this idea that maybe suburban life was not all it was cracked up to be. Because if you think about your stereotypical suburban man, he's going off to work. He's doing a job like many other men. He's driving a car just like many other, it's a Chevy or a Ford or something. It's pretty much an identical car the next guy next, in the next row over. He comes home to a house that's very similar to the one right next to him, because they live in the suburbs and the houses are more or less identical. They're watching the same TV programs, eating the same types of foods. Their kids go to the same types of schools. Their wives stay home. I mean, everything is just very, very similar. There's no real individuality. And that's the attack of this book, is this conformity of the 50s is stifling for many. All right, this brings us to our next group of critics of the 1950s culture. They are referred to by different names. Sometimes they're referred to as the Beat generation. Sometimes they're called Beatniks, or just Beats for short. And the Beatniks were typically college-educated city dwellers who saw in the 1950s a culture that was stifling, was conformist, was difficult to really embrace and fit in, one that doesn't allow deviation or creativity. And so they try to push back against this. They're writing poetry, they're listening to and playing jazz, they're taking drugs, they're living lives that are not suburban, stories where it's the man and the wife and the 2.5 kids and all that. I mean, they're living a very different life. And in some ways, these are kind of like 1950s hippies. These are like proto-hippies in some ways. Probably the most famous of the Beats was a novelist named Jack Kerouac, who in 1957 wrote a novel called On the Road. And On the Road is more or less an autobiographical novel in which he writes about these crazy, freedom-loving, spontaneous, often drug-filled adventures and road trips that he and his beatnik friends would take. And it really comes to symbolize that freedom that some people were embracing while others were embracing the conformity of the 1950s. And famously, this book was written on a scroll. So Jack Kerouac he had this giant scroll, and he would just type and type and type and type and write the novel on a scroll. Okay, so that's about it for this. Now, I do want to say one more thing about 1950s culture. It's tempting to assume that the standard culture that people criticized, whether it's the Beatniks or Betty Friedan or whomever, that this culture was despised and it was a mistake or something. But the reality is, the vast majority of Americans enjoyed that life, and they enjoyed the 1950s, and they really look back at it fondly. And they didn't believe in what a lot of the criticisms of it were. They didn't see it as conforming or stifling. They didn't see it as a kind of a prison for women. A lot of women embraced their role as a mother in the 1950s. And so that's what we see in the 1950s is this interesting conflict between differing visions of what America really should be. And that is, of course, something we're going to explore as we get in the 1960s. That division and that confusion over what America should be culturally is really going to explode into something else in the 1960s. All right, guys, that's it for culture after 1945. And in our next video, we'll keep working our way through period 8.